So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the theme of survival. So obviously in this novel, we have a scenario where survival is the main idea or complication in Pi's life. And so we'll talk a little bit about what enables him to survive this experience, and what he does, on a daily level almost, to overcome some of the obstacles in his survival. So if you think about just the idea of, what Pi has to survive while he is lost adrift on the Pacific Ocean, there are sort of both physical and mental or emotional obstacles to achieving survival. So physically, you could think about the necessities of human existence. So having fresh water is essential for sustaining human life. So he has to find water. He's surrounded by water. This is one of the ironies of being lost at sea, but there is, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink, is kind of the famous line from Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And that's Pi's predicament, right? He's surrounded by water, but none of it is drinkable because it's all salt water. So he has to find access to fresh water. So that's the number one thing, is to alleviate thirst. That's the basic, one of the basic sort of human necessities. Second one is obviously food. So hunger has to be fulfilled or satiated. And Pi has to find food for himself and also for Richard Parker. So this sort of scenario he's in, he does need to find or feed himself. So he has a couple of options. Obviously, there are some rations aboard the lifeboat, but he's going to have to learn how to fish and, become somewhat of a, hunter-gatherer type of person, right? So he has to learn how to provide for himself, become a provider. So this is one of the sort of additional responsibilities or lessons that he's going to learn how to do to overcome his obstacle. And then if those are sort of the main physical ones, he also sort of has to battle the elements of nature. If you think about, rain, that he'll endure a lot of storms and rain where his body is wet. So that also becomes a burden or hardship on him, is, how do you stay dry and protected from the sun as well. So, just the natural environment around him can also be very dangerous and deadly. Obviously, there's sharks around as well, so he can't, just go for a swim if he wants and cool off. So there are sort of lots of natural, environmental obstacles that are also part of his struggle to survive. And then those are kind of the physical conflicts that he has to endure, in addition to the presence of Richard Parker. So that's sort of on top of these other factors, is the fact that Richard Parker, a Bengal tiger, is aboard the life raft and poses another concern or danger to his well-being. And then in the second side would be more of like the internal conflicts that a survivor might struggle with in this scenario. So if you think about survival and what it actually takes, the toll it takes psychologically or emotionally on the individual, that's another kind of burden that somebody might face. So Pi will also experience a lot of like internal conflicts within himself, and often it's sort of the internal struggles that are even more daunting or difficult to overcome. So for Pi, we've seen him struggle. He'll struggle with a sense of loss, and he needs to, obviously he's lost his friends or his family, so he would be, very emotionally distraught, very sad and grieving, and he could easily fall within a deep depression and give up. But he chooses sort of a different path, and um, Richard Parker becomes a kind of diversion or distraction, keeping his mind occupied so he can't dwell on the reality of the situation, which is that he's lost everything in life, his home, his family. So if he can sort of divert his thoughts in a more productive, distraction, which is Richard Parker, um, that's how he kind of is able to overcome the mental uh, burden or hurdle of his family's loss. So he's not only dealing with this grieving for a lost childhood, a lost family, a lost homeland. He's also has to struggle within himself about who he is and what he's capable of doing. So obviously he has to overcome a lot of his fears to do things that he couldn't imagine himself doing prior to this event. He's going to have to learn how to kill, which is an important sort of turning point for his character. He's going to have to become, he's going to cut fish apart with his hands and rip them apart and eat them, fresh out of the ocean. And so he becomes, he goes from being a very gentle, innocent little vegetarian boy into a more adept hunter, killer, and able to sort of provide for himself as a stronger individual. So if we're talking or looking at the Bildungsroman genre that we mentioned in a previous lecture, you do see a sort of transformation of his character as he moves and overcomes a lot of barriers in terms of what he thinks he's capable of doing, and also growing up, learning new skills and valuable life lessons along the way. So he overcomes his fears and his doubts in himself, and he's able to become a good provider of food and water. And he ends up being very resourceful. He creates that secondary raft, which basically saves his life, and he's able to use the knowledge that he gains from his survival manual, but he also learns, how to fish properly or how to fish successfully, how to kill large fish too, and support both himself and Richard Parker. So he does become this kind of provider character. And then other internal conflicts that Pi might have, he could also maybe struggle. You could see him struggling with his faith a little bit, maybe. He never quite loses his faith in God at any point. He's stronger. He just maybe grows stronger or more, maybe starts to question some of his earlier beliefs, but he never gives up his hopes of surviving this. He has what he calls a fierce will to survive. So he's a fighter, right? He's going to learn and endure no matter what. But he does face certain points of crisis that will start to definitely challenge or test his faith. We'll say that. There'll be a storm where he'll lose a lot of his sort of the necessities that he's built up, his fishing raft and some of the rations even. So some things will test him along the way, but as we'll see, he never loses his hope of survival, and he never loses his faith in God or his spiritual sense, and he never gives up. So he has this strength of will to live that makes him a survivor. So When you're reading, you can kind of look at the challenges, the different challenges that Pi is facing in terms of the obstacles in front of him. Make note of both the physical or external conflicts, um, the natural environment, hunger, thirst, those kinds of things. But I also want you to think about some of the internal conflicts that Pi is going through as he endures this experience. So things like fear, doubt, loss, crisis of faith, changes in his identity or how he views himself, all those are kind of more of the internal conflicts that he's going to face. So a question I'm asking you guys for this lecture is to think about the activities that Pi does in his day-to-day life on the raft that keep his mind occupied. So that's what a lot of this sort of busy work is all about, is just to keep his mind distracted on something other than loss and despair and fear and doubt. So he has to have things to do, or else he would just, give into depression, the darkness, and grief. So he does build a kind of steady routine that revolves largely around two things. One, his faith in God, and two, Richard Parker. So he's got those two things keeping him kind of centered and focused on the daily occurrences in his day-to-day life. So God and Richard Parker both keep him preoccupied and busy. So if you look on page 210, he does kind of have a schedule, or he sort of tells you his typical day. And this is how he says, I survived 227 days, and, he has a kind of routine that he keeps him kind of sane as well. You can think about it that way too. So there's also that question of, if you're in this situation, you could easily lose grasp of reality. The not just like the thirst and the hunger that could get to you, but again, you might have, you could lose your mind basically in this scenario. You're alone on a life raft. There's no other human around you. Even that could drive somebody beyond the breaking point of sanity. So that's also another struggle that he could be dealing with. So if you look on page 210, this is his routine. So you can kind of see some patterns building here. So sunrise to mid-morning, wake up, prayers, breakfast for Richard Parker, general inspection of raft and lifeboat with particular attention paid to all knots and ropes, tending of solar stills, breakfast and inspection of food stores, fishing and preparing of fish, if any caught, gutting, cleaning, hanging of strips of flesh on lines to cure in the sun. Mid-morning to late afternoon, prayers, light lunch, rest and restful activities, such as writing in diary, examining of scabs and sores, upkeeping of equipment, puttering about locker, observation and study of Richard Parker, picking at of turtle bones. Late afternoon to early evening, prayers, fishing and preparing of fish, tending of curing strips of fish, dinner preparations, dinner for self and Richard Parker. Sunset, general inspection of raft and lifeboat, collecting and safekeeping of distillate from solar stills, storing all of food and equipment, arrangement of night, making a bed, safe storage of raft, etc. Prayers, night, fitful sleeping, prayers. So as we can see how he divides his day, there are certain kind of repeated patterns that we see. So obviously prayer stands out to me immediately because it's in every single section. So you could see how his faith in a higher power maintains throughout his survival, and it's sort of key to not giving up and to having a fierce will to survive, right? So religion, spirituality, obviously a necessity for Pi's survival. Second thing A lot of his day, you'll notice, revolves around food, procuring of food, preparation of food. So hunger, the physical necessity of eating and providing for himself and Richard Parker with water and food are the two basic, physical things, physical necessities of all life. So he's got those at every point as well. And then the last one is, Richard Parker. So he has to feed Richard Parker. At certain points, he just observes and studies Richard Parker. And then general, just feeding and looking after Richard Parker, tending to Richard Parker's presence aboard the life raft. So all of those things are kind of keeping him mentally occupied, distracted, and keeping him alive, basically. So he can't survive with any one of those things gone. So his spirituality, the bare necessities of food and thirst, and Richard Parker are all necessities in Pi's survival.